Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. I guess this is the last part of our Center of events today around the title, Montreal 2050, a Climate Haven. Welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space. Just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Forest Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. We're also running this as a live stream Zoom meeting, so those of you joining us there, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat. Same here in the space. If you do, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you. Okay, to introduce our guest, I'm happy to pass the microphone over to doctoral candidate in Geography and Environmental Studies, 2025 Concordia Public Scholar, Alex Pache. Alex, over to you.
Hi, everybody again. Today I'm here with Mr. Oriol Galvada. Galvada. And we're here to talk about Plan Net Zero. So in April 2023, Concordia announced this ambitious plan to decarbonize and called it Plan Net Zero. Great news for the Concordia community. Since that time, there haven't been many public updates about the initiative and the progress that they've made and what are the plans. So I know the Concordia community is curious and we're here to talk about exactly that. Mr. Galvada is the manager of the decarbonization initiatives at Concordia's Next Generation Institute. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please explain to us what is Plan Net Zero. Tell us about yourself, your role in the project, and what is Next Generation Cities Institute and how does Plan Net Zero fit in?
Perfect. This Plan Net Zero initiative basically is looking at decarbonizing the full campuses of Concordia by converting them into living labs. So the central point of this initiative is the concept of living labs. And basically living labs, for those who don't know, are those collaborative approaches to developing innovations, just collaborating between private stakeholders, academia, government, the civil society, and the environment. So the idea is to develop these innovations together with all these sectors, and we want to do that for the 80 buildings of the campus. So Concordia wants to reduce the consumption, wants to increase the resilience of all the buildings and all the surroundings of the campus by converting those buildings into places where people will experiment and create innovations in real spaces. My role here in the Plan Net Zero, in fact, the person that was leading that is Stéphane Chaillet. He's not here. I'm more representing I would say, the research part. I've been leading the integration of research concepts into living lab. So the idea is there's a strong part here that's been led by facilities management. So to convert all the buildings into decarbonized buildings, we need people that manage buildings, that reduce consumptions, that know what happens in buildings. But we as researchers wanted to incorporate lots of ideas into those call for projects. And I was the person leading the integration of different initiatives in these call for projects. The Next Generation Cities Institute, where I work for, is an institute that gathers around 200 researchers in Concordia, and that tries to develop decarbonization and livability and resilient solutions for cities of the future, but not looking at them from a purely technical approach, looking at them from a holistic approach. So we have people inside the Next Generation Cities Institute dealing with visual arts, and the artistic profile of problems, where people looking at mobility, at transportation, and people looking at the building sector purely. So it's quite a holistic approach at how to improve the cities of the future.
And what's your history in this sector? Do you have a doctorate or
I started my doctorate, I did not finish, but I come from the private cooperative sector in Spain. I've been more than 20 years in Spain working with research and with consultancy at the same time. I've been doing both worlds, and when Ursula contacted me, Ursula, who's the director of the Next Generation Cities Institute, she wanted research to be applied and be impactful. And so I have this double profile of research and at the same time knowing real life issues. And my goal was to bring all the research, these bright researchers, these super bright gray matter people, were thinking of, but could not apply to reality. And I, knowing a little bit the world and things that can happen and not happen, have come here to try to bring these magnificent ideas, bring them down to reality as much as possible.
And so are the issues that you've dealt with, or problems you've solved in Spain, do they translate well to the problems in Montreal?
I mean, not all of them. Some of them, in fact, humans are humans everywhere, and energy demand is energy demand. Of course, there we have a climate that's quite different from here, and solutions can change a little bit. But the general concept of how to integrate research with impact in CO2, so we are all suffering from the same climate change. So the attitude we have to take towards being more impactful and being more urgent in our decisions is the same everywhere. So I feel more or less I'm doing the same, but I have had to adapt to a different environment.
And so the goal of Planet Zero is to eventually, or is it by 2040? Or
It's, basically, we have 15 years, more or less, 2040, to decarbonize the full campus, both campuses of Concordia. Not only decarbonize, convert them into energy resilient campuses. Okay. So it's not only dealing with mitigation, but as well with adaptation.
Right.
We understand that not everything will be able to be solved with mitigation. Climate change is here, the temperature will increase, and so we have to adapt ourselves to this increase of temperature that, we want it or not, will happen.
Right. And so for Concordia, where does most of our emissions come from?
In Concordia, I mean, again, emissions can lie a little bit, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I come more from the technical scientific approach, and I want to make it very clear. Here, there has been a very good work from the Office of Sustainability evaluating all the emissions in Concordia, and more than 50% of the emissions come from transport. So it's scope 3 emissions, basically mobility emissions, people coming and going to Concordia. So this is like the big chunk. And almost 34% comes from direct emissions from gas combustion. Okay. Still, that hides a very big number, which is we have an electrical consumption that's 2.5 times the consumption of gas. And electricity, since we are in Quebec, and electricity comes from a very renewable sources, is not counted as an emitter. But it's still our responsibility to reduce consumption. Right. And so by not looking at electricity, we're doing a weak favor to climate emergency, because this electricity could be used for other things if we keep consuming it. Right. Even if it doesn't appear in our balance, CO2 balance, it's probably more important even than gas. So that's important that we tackle especially mobility and commuting and direct emissions, but at the same time that we reduce electricity consumption.
But for Concordia transportation, what is being transported? Really?
It's basically commuting. It's the fact that students go back and forth from different places. So whenever we talk about emissions, there are like scope 1 emissions, which is the emissions that are directly produced by Concordia. So for instance, burning gas to heat up those spaces. This is scope 1 emission. Scope 2 is we use electricity, and this electricity somewhere else produces some emissions. So this is scope 2 emissions. And scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that are not really linked to Concordia, but are caused by the fact of Concordia being here. So we're a university, people come and go using cars, using buses that don't use always electricity. Normally they use fuel. All these movements inside Concordia are caused by this commuting aspect, these scope 3 emissions that are very important in Concordia.
So where most of Concordia's emissions comes are actually something that Concordia has very little control over?
I think we could. Again, in the Climate Action Task Force, we're commenting that. And one of the important things would be to facilitate as much as possible people using active transportation modes, people using public transportation modes instead of using their cars to come to Concordia. So that's something that, of course, Concordia has no direct control on them, but we can nudge people to use them. If we put more biking parks, I mean, in our building, for instance, the bike park is closed from the 1st of November to the 1st of April. that are lots of months where people like me that love driving bikes in winter, even if it's chilled, I cannot park my bike in my place. So I have to park it outside, and parking bikes outside, some people, I mean, I have not a very expensive bike, so I can park it outside, but most people would say, I prefer to go by car or using other public transportation modes than.
Yeah, I didn't have an expensive bike either, and it got stolen right here.
Okay,
Having an inside space for that is definitely useful. From my understanding, the first phase, the Plan Net Zero is happening in several phases.
Yes.
And the first phase is mostly about the buildings.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, basically there's the first phase we consider as a pilot phase that's based in one building, which is the GM building. The rest of phases will probably merge public space and buildings. So phase 2, we're thinking probably of something related to Loyola. It's not yet sure, but whenever dealing with a campus as big as Loyola, maybe the focus will not only be the buildings, will be many things around the buildings, integrating public space, integrating resilience, integrating other aspects.
Right. So when it comes to buildings, most of those emissions are from the heating.
Yes.
And heating in these huge buildings is pretty much all done by natural gas, boiling water that then heat. How does it work there?
Well, basically you burn gas, you heat the water, there's a distribution system that brings water to several places, and those places emit heating, or you heat up the air that comes through the air ducts to the different spaces. Okay. So this is, but basically in the origin, you're burning gas to heat all of that.
And do we already have the technology to switch that out? Like, I've heard of like replacing natural gas with hydrogen. So hydrogen, for those not in the know, we're able to separate hydrogen from water and then burn that to create energy in a similar way that we do with natural gas. And the problem is, of course, that it's hard to create that hydrogen because you need to use energy to create it. You could get it from natural gas separately, but that doesn't really solve any of the issues. So what sort of technology are we planning to use to replace these natural gas boilers?
Basically, the big solution, especially here in Quebec, where our electricity is very clean, is moving from a fossil fuel to electricity. Electricity is not a generation method, it's a vector. It brings energy from somewhere. You have to produce it somewhere else. Here we have the lack of having hydro-generating plants that are renewable energy plants and bring electricity. So to heat up the air, we can use either very inefficient electricity sources like electrical boilers that basically do the same as we do with gas with electricity. But here we have other solutions that are much more interesting, which are heat pumps. Heat pumps basically, in an electrical boiler, you put 1 kilowatt hour of electricity and you get 1 kilowatt hour of heat. That's quite easy to understand. In a heat pump, you put 1 kilowatt hour of electricity and you get 3 kilowatt hours of heat.
Oh, wow.
So it's 3 times as efficient, which is the problem with heat pumps. Heat pumps can be air source. I mean, heat pumps basically get the energy from somewhere and put it somewhere else, okay, with this very high efficiency. But if the source is, I want to get this source at 25 degrees and the outside source is at minus 15, like one of these days, the effort they need to do is huge. Right. And maybe you don't get this efficiency of 3, you get the efficiency of 1.5. And sometimes even if the temperature is minus 25, they are not working. Okay, so the idea is heat pumps are a very good potential source to increase the efficiency of our systems and reduce the CO2 emissions, but in some conditions they don't work. But in those conditions, for instance, there are other solutions like geothermal heat pumps. You can use the heat of the ground. Instead of going outside the air, you go to the ground, which is at more stable temperature, and you somehow, with some mediums, refrigerants, you get this heat and you put it inside the place. Or a solution that's super interesting is sewage water contains lots of heat. We have showers, and this heat, we're throwing it away.
Right, and you can see the steam coming out.
You see, and then the idea is, and those are solutions that are, for instance, in Vancouver, in one of the neighborhoods in Falls Creek, they are using sewage water heat pumps, and it's being implemented, and it's working very well. So technologies are there, and it's the will that we need to implement those technologies in our spaces.
Okay,
Gas is easier, but I think we need to increase this use of these technologies.
So how is that where there's some sort of way to, it's like a heat pump, but it's taking, instead of taking
there's an exchanger that basically, and it's a bit dirty, and sorry for the idea, basically you filter the shit out of the water and use the water that's hot, and you put that water with a heat exchanger into the heat pump, and the heat pump lifts the temperature of this water.
Okay. And just to clarify, because I've heard so much about heat pumps, but I don't really fully understand it, it's how are we getting that 3 instead of 1-to-1, the 3-to-1?
This is the refrigerant cycle that you have in the refrigerator in your house. Okay. It works exactly the same as the refrigerator in your house, but it's an inverse cycle. In the refrigerator of your house, what you do is basically extracting heat from inside the cabin of the refrigerator and throwing it behind.
That's why the back is always hot, or the bottom.
Yes. So that's the same effect, and there's the Rankine, the inverse Rankine cycle that basically explains how you, through evaporation of a refrigerant and condensation, it's a bit more complex than that, but you can get this COP, this efficient. COP is the efficiency of a heat pump of 3.
Right.
And again, the closer the sources, the higher the efficiency.
And so is this technology, has it already been implemented in huge buildings like we have at Concordia?
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, it's been massively implemented. And the problem here in Quebec, especially, not Canada, is that electricity prices are really low. And the push to implement very efficient technologies is not so strong because electricity is so cheap that the payback of an investment as such is not always easy. It's a long-term investment. So, I mean, you must think that in Quebec you have the lowest prices of electricity of North America and part of Central America even. I mean, you have very, very low electricity prices.
Right. And so the first building that's going to be retrofitted, so this boiler is going to get replaced with a heat pump, that's what retrofitting is, basically?
Well, retrofitting is a more complex system because you're looking at everything. You have a building, and changing the energy system is one solution, which is interesting, but the skin of the building is an important part as well. If you have an old building that has lots of air leakages, and I don't know if in your houses, but in my house, I put the hand next to a window and lots of draft of air are coming in. And these are a lot of losses of energy. If we change the skin of the building, maybe this energy system that had a power like that, we can reduce it by an energy system that needs a power like that, and then we can buy a fancier energy system. So if I don't change anything and I go to the boiler that I have with natural gas and I change one by one this boiler for a fancy heat pump, it will cost me a lot of money. But if I combine the insulation of the building, changing some of the glazing, covering some of the leakages of the building with the incorporation of a fancier system, maybe I will have to invest much less money overall, and I have to analyze that. So in the first phase, the idea is that a combined approach. Moreover, there's something very important here in Concordia we're trying to tackle, is the lack of occupancy of spaces. We, in the Next Generation Institute, during COVID, we made some analysis on the electrical consumption of the buildings, and especially the EV building. When it was COVID, it was not occupied. People were not here. In winter, it consumed 60% of the energy it had consumed the winter before. So a building that was not occupied at all consumed 60% of the energy that building when it was occupied. So managing occupancy is a very important issue to be able to reduce energy consumption. So when buildings are not occupied, they should not be consumed. That's the first point. And the second point, which is very important, is there are lots of spaces in Concordia, and probably you've walked around in them, that are no more than 20, 30% occupied in a normal basis. And that's not sustainable.
Right.
Spaces should be occupied. And if you are not occupying a space, and there's lots of a closed office, and you go there once a week, and you stay home 4 days a week, that's not sustainable.
Right.
So open spaces with more occupancy, flexible occupancy spaces are another of the solutions. Dealing with buildings again, and that don't need such high investments.
Right. I just want to fix your mic
Yeah,
because
no
it's rubbing against your shirt.
I'm moving a bit too much. Okay.
This just came to mind. Does the occupancy affect the heating in that just people's bodies will reduce the amount of heating needed? Like, does that have a negligible effect?
No, it does. It's important. The better the building is. I mean, if the building has lots of draft, the impact of human beings, which are heating radiators, is not so important because you lose energy everywhere. But the better the building is, the more important. For instance, it's quite funny that in some more efficient buildings, you start to get much higher cooling demands because you insulate the building, but then people keep bringing their heat to the building, and so you have to cool it down. Either you do some intelligent measures that you can find, but still, yeah, it's important to have. But for me, the important thing is being able not to have unoccupied spaces, like even from an asset management perspective.
But then retrofitting, are you actually doing renovations, like removing the walls and adding insulation or changing the windows?
There are lots of solutions. I mean, curtain walls like the one Davy building are very difficult. You have to extract probably everything and substitute it. But in all buildings, there are ways of putting solutions on top of the building, changing the glazing, that are not so expensive and not so complex as, again, in curtain walls, which are those glass facades that you see.
Right.
Most times you have to extract everything, the structure is there, and you have to re-put everything. In other buildings, it's much easier.
Okay.
You can just add insulation on top,
Right.
and you solve part of these problems. Yeah, again, sorry.
I'll put it up higher.
If you want me to take the micro.
I think it'll be okay there. Yeah. So the first target building is the GM building, which is just down the street there. And it's a bit surprising to me because we're retrofitting a building that looks pretty new. Like, wasn't that building only built like 20 years ago, maybe? So has there been that much of a difference in the regulations and building codes?
Well, that's a very fair and very good point. But the thing is, and when I say we, I'm just adding people from facility management, governance bodies of the university. We had to look at a building that was easy to work with and that affected a group of people that was not students. So this is the building for administration. So it was a little bit, giving the example, they were saying, okay, we'll suffer if this building has problems, so we can use this as a pilot case. And it's a small building. For instance, other buildings consume much more energy. This building consumes quite a lot of energy. That was one of the points that we're seeing. Even if it's new, from the benchmarking perspective, it consumes quite a lot of energy, one. Two, it's a building for administration, so we can move people back and forth, and we only tamper with the work of management of the university and not with the daily life of students. So that was the second point. And it's not so big, which was, for the first project, we needed something that was relatively small, not so small as the small buildings of Concordia, but between the big buildings, that it would be the smallest. And again, there were some discussions in changing the buildings, but in the end, out of a weighting factor, it was chosen to be this.
Right. And so after the phase of retrofitting buildings, the end goal is to do that to every building at Concordia?
Yeah, yes, but we'll need some financing. But yes,
Right.
The goal is that.
And after this phase about retrofitting buildings, what sort of ideas are proposed for after the retrofitting buildings?
At the moment, it's very open because we really wanted to develop together with the legal department, procurement. I mean, there have been lots of steps before we could open the call for proposals for the GM building. And we wanted to learn all the full process of converting a building into a living lab from the IITS perspective. For instance, I don't know if people who have been in Concordia know that working with IITS is not always the easiest way, and we needed them to be on board, and they are on board. And
Isn't that the IT?
the IT department, sorry, it's the IT department.
They have to be on board for
well,
that?
basically, if we have to create lots of measures that we have to add innovations in the middle of the spaces that use IoT, that use the network, that connect to the internet and do things with the internet and come back. We need them on board. We're going to innovate in these buildings.
Okay, so it's more than about just physical changes. This is also like a
lots of
network.
control. I mean, probably the biggest weight will be in control of the spaces, control of the occupancy that I was mentioning, being able to monitor the different spaces and saying, okay, there's no one here, shut down the energy system, shut up, do that, use some AI methodologies to be able to forecast if this space will be occupied, if tomorrow's weather will be very cold, and so you should start heating now. So all those things will happen and will interact with the physical spaces of Concordia, and that might cause some problems. I mean, maybe we won't get the temperatures that we desire. So this is good that people from management suffer this first pilot phase, not students.
Right, okay, I see.
Okay, and in next steps, I think the main focus will be buildings, definitely. But for instance, working with the transportation system between the two campuses of Concordia, working with outside spaces of the Loyola campus, which is, that might be interesting. Again, everything related to innovation with the living labs is not always directly linked to buildings. It can be linked to any other aspects of decarbonization.
Right. Yeah, and I guess there's important things to consider. The transportation for Loyola to the downtown campus is it's a city bus. And I guess ideally Concordia would want to replace that city bus with an electric city bus, but then if they own the bus, sometimes it's better, from my understanding, to let it run its course rather than run its course as in we keep the bus until it doesn't run anymore, even though it's fossil fuels, because getting rid of that bus and producing a new one is actually a bigger detriment.
Yeah, now in this case, for instance, there are some analyses being made on either buying electrical buses or something that I think is more intelligent maybe is getting together with STM and saying, why not creating a shared line that goes from campus to the other campus, and maybe in the middle you do some more stops. But again, those discussions are being held by the people in facilities management who are doing an excellent job, saying, do we buy very expensive electrical buses, or do we try to find synergies with the transportation system of the city?
Right. So after, in 2040, or is it 2040 or 2050? So it's 2040?
The idea is 15 years. Again, this is a very optimistic vision, and we're doing the phase one, and so the rest will come if things work well.
So let's say most of the emissions are down to zero by 2040, 2050. From the Planet Zero website, I saw that there's the mention of carbon credits. So what sort of emissions do we expect to be left over, and what is the relationship between that and the carbon credits to get us to neutral? Because the idea is even if you still have, and this applies to a national level and cities in general, if you still have, that's why we say net zero, if you still have emissions, you offset them by either purchasing carbon credits or having something that is sucking or sinking carbon back into some sort of storage. So how does carbon credits get involved?
Well, here we have different visions inside the group, but again, It's true that in Loyola we have a situation that's a bit problematic, which is, I was telling you that I would say most of the changes to get rid of CO2 emissions from direct combustion of gas go through converting things into electrical. So that's basically the logical step. However, in the Loyola campus, we have a limit of power. There's a transformer that's limited. And so even if we want to convert things from gas to electrical, it's not so easy because we have a cap of the electricity that we can consume there.
Right.
One solution would be to keep a little bit of gas. So trying to solve most of the problems, but for the days where we are at minus 25, minus 30, 2, 3, 5% of the time, being able to use those gas boilers we still have.
Right.
So it would be, okay, let's do a 95% CO2-free system, but for those peak moments, why not using this gas resource? And this gas resource, for instance, should be the one to be compensated for by carbon credits.
Okay.
And I know that there are discussions about carbon credits, and I myself, as an environmentalist, I don't believe so much in carbon credits, but I still think they have a role. And the normal critics of carbon credits are, okay, people are paying to keep emitting emissions, that the richer can do whatever they want and they keep paying credits. The way of accounting carbon credits is not always the best. So it's not really clear and open, and sometimes credits are accounted for things that already happen. So, the Amazon emissions, the trees are still there, and that's fine. But at the same time, people are considering that these carbon emissions absorbed by the Amazon that would have been absorbed the same way, you count them as if they absorbed your emissions. So those critics, I understand them, but at the same time, for me, carbon credits have some advantages because we are in a transition. And if we have those goals, like Sydney mentioned before, of being carbon neutral by 2040, even the most optimistic researcher and technician knows that it's impossible to reach that point without some tool like carbon credits that can act here. And for me, moreover, normally it's a very good way of, at least even if it's small, giving some money from the rich countries that have emitted a lot to the poor countries that are absorbing a lot of CO2. So again, there are backs and forths. And for me, if the carbon credits are limited to a very small amount, I think it's not so problematic.
Right. And so for going back to the GM building, that phase one, what's the time, would we expect that the actual boilers will be changed and there'll be sensors everywhere? What is the timeline for that?
Yeah, I want first of all to praise the team of facilities management, procurement, and legal, because mounting a project as the one that's been mounted, including living labs, including research in the call for proposals, was super complicated. It's something that's not been done, at least here in Quebec, and what they did in a super fast 1 year and something time, it's astounding. Now we are in the final phase, so there were like two phases. First phase where there was a pre-selection of teams, then 2 teams were chosen, and those teams did a very long process of completely auditing the system to be able to give a value to the measures they did. And now we're in the process of analyzing those 2 offers. Probably in 2-3 months, the final offer will be given, and they will start with their work. And this work will start during, say, 1-2 years, changing everything. So we can expect by the end of 2025 to already have lots of things going on in this building. The good thing is the contractor has to assume some very ambitious objectives of decarbonization and very ambitious objectives of creating the space for living labs to be implemented in their space. Okay. So again, it's very soon. You'll see things very soon.
That's great to hear. The time is up already. Thank you so much for
Thank you very much.
for spreading the the knowledge about Plan Net Zero, and I feel personally a lot more positive about Concordia in general.
Happy to hear.
Yeah, and that we're pioneering in a lot of way. That's really inspiring, and I hope it'll inspire students when they listen to this as well. So thank you, Oriol.
I expect it. Thank you very much.
Alex, thank you. Thank you for bringing all three of these events to Force Space today, and just having like the constant and like different perspectives on not just Montreal as a climate haven, but the conversation around that as well. And I appreciate all of your work bringing that together. Just going to let everyone know on Zoom, online, we're going to be closing up the live stream now. But of course, this remains available on our YouTube channel, and you should obviously revisit it. And have a great afternoon.